Welcome, and settle in. Tonight we drift into the gentle beginning of the Autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, a calm remembrance of family, fortune, and early lessons. If you enjoy this, please like and subscribe. It helps us immensely and allows us to continue sharing peaceful bedtime history. In quiet retirement, I take pleasure in recalling the small anecdotes of my ancestors. You may remember how, when we were together in England, I inquired among our relations, even traveling for that purpose, thinking it may be agreeable to you to know the circumstances of my life, many of which remain unknown to you. I sit down to write them during a week of leisure. I do this for several reasons. I rose from poverty and obscurity to a state of some affluence and reputation, and I enjoyed a fair share of felicity along the way. My posterity may wish to know the means I used, which, under the blessing of God, succeeded so well that they may find something fit to imitate. At times I have thought, if it were offered to me, I would not object to living the same life again from the beginning, with only the advantage that authors enjoy in a second edition, the chance to correct a few faults. Even without that, I would accept the offer, since such a repetition is not to be expected. The nearest thing is to recollect one's life, and make that recollection durable by writing it. In so doing, I indulge the inclination, natural to old men, to speak of themselves and their past actions, yet without being tiresome. Since this may be read or left unread as one pleases, I may as well own that I gratify some vanity, which few will doubt. I have seldom heard the words without vanity. I may say, without some vain thing following. Yet I give vanity fair quarter where I find it, for it often produces good to the possessor, and to others within his reach. Contemporaries such as Gibbon and Hume, great British historians, expressed a similar feeling about modest self, praise in their own lives, and speaking of gratitude, I humbly acknowledge that I owe the happiness of my past life to the kind providence of God. He led me to the means I used and gave them success. This belief gives me hope, though I do not presume that the same goodness will continue, either to preserve that happiness or to enable me to bear reverses, should they come among the papers of an uncle who shared my curiosity for family history. I found notes about our forebears. From these I learned that our family lived in the village of Ecton in Northamptonshire for 300 years, perhaps from the time when the name Franklin, once the name of a class of people, was taken as a family surname. They held a freehold of about 30 acres, helped by the smith's trade, which the eldest son followed from father to son. When I searched the parish registers at Ecton, I found records of births, marriages, and burials from the year 1555. By that register, I perceived that I was the youngest son of the youngest son for 5 generations. My grandfather Thomas, born in 1598, lived at Ecton until old age took him from business, then went to live with his son John, a dyer at Banbury in Oxfordshire, with whom my father served his apprenticeship. There my grandfather died and lies buried. We saw his gravestone in 1758. His eldest son, Thomas, kept the house at Ecton and left it to his only child, a daughter, who with her husband sold it to Mr. Isted. Now lord of the manor, my grandfather had 4 sons who grew to manhood, Thomas, John, Benjamin, and Josiah. I will give what account I can of them from memory. Thomas was bred a smith, yet, being ingenious and encouraged in learning by Esquire Palmer, the principal gentleman of the parish, he qualified himself as a scrivener. He became a notable man in the county, a mover of public-spirited undertakings for Northampton and for Ecton, and was much noticed and patronized by the then Lord Halifax. He died on the 6th of January, 1702, old style, 4 years to a day before my own birth. The account we received of his life and character from old people at Ecton struck you by its similarity to what you knew of mine. You once observed that, had he died on the same day, one might have supposed a transmigration. John was bred a dyer, I believe of woolens. Benjamin, my uncle, was bred a silk dyer in London. He was an ingenious man, and I remember him well. When I was a boy, he came over to my father in Boston and lived with us some years. He lived to a great age. His grandson, Samuel Franklin, later lived in Boston. My uncle Benjamin left behind 2 large manuscript volumes of his own poetry. Occasional pieces addressed to friends and relations. He had formed a shorthand of his own and taught it to me. But not practicing it, I have forgotten it. I was named after this uncle, for there was a particular affection between him and my father. He was very pious, a constant attender of sermons by the best preachers, which he took down in his shorthand, keeping many volumes of them. He was also much of a politician, perhaps too much for his station in London. A dealer in old books brought me a collection he had made of the principal pamphlets relating to public affairs from 1641 to 1717. Many volumes were missing, as the numbering showed. Yet 8 folios and 24 volumes of smaller size remained, with many of his notes in the margins. It seems my uncle left them in England when he sailed to America about 50 years before. Through these papers and tales, I saw how our obscure family stood early with the Reformation and continued Protestants through the reign of Queen Mary, sometimes in danger for their zeal against popery. They had an English Bible, which they concealed under the cover of a joint stool. Fastened open with tapes, my great-great-grandfather would turn the stool upon his knees, turning the leaves under the tapes as he read to his family. One of the children watched at the door for the apparitor, the officer of the spiritual court, and at the first sign the stool was set upright again. The Bible hidden beneath this anecdote I had from my Uncle Benjamin. The family remained of the Church of England until near the end of the reign of Charles II, then, when outed ministers held conventicles in Northamptonshire. My uncles Benjamin and Josiah adhered to them, and continued so all their lives. The rest of the family kept to the Episcopal Church in time. My father, Josiah, married young, and carried his wife with 3 children into New England, about the year 1682. The conventicles had been forbidden by law and were frequently disturbed, which induced some considerable men of his acquaintance to remove to that country. He was prevailed on to accompany them, where they expected to enjoy their mode of religion with freedom. By the same wife he had 4 more children there, and by a second wife 10 more, in all 17. I remember 13 sitting at one time at his table, all grown and all married in due course. I was the youngest son, and the youngest but 2, born in Boston, New England. My birthplace was on Milk Street in Boston. My mother, the second wife, was Abiah Folger, daughter of Peter Folger, one of the first settlers of New England. Cotton Mather made honorable mention of him in his church history of that country. I have heard that Peter Folger wrote sundry small occasional pieces, but only one was printed, which I saw many years ago. Written in 1675 in the homespun verse of the time, it addressed those in government. It spoke strongly for liberty of conscience and for the Baptists, Quakers, and other sectaries who had suffered it, said that the Indian wars and other distresses were judgments upon the persecution, and urged repeal of those uncharitable laws. The whole seemed to me written with decent plainness and manly freedom. In closing, he declared that his censure sprang from goodwill, and that he would be known as the author, signing from Sherburne Town with his name, Peter Folger. My elder brothers were apprenticed to different trades. I was sent to the grammar school. At 8 years of age, my father, intending to devote me, the tithe of his sons, to the service of the church, I learned to read very early, so early that I do not remember when I could not read. My uncle Benjamin approved the plan and proposed to give me all his shorthand volumes of sermons as a stock to set up with. If I would learn his characters, I stayed at the grammar school not quite a year, though in that time I rose from the middle of my class to the head and was moved up with the aim of reaching the third class at the end of the year. Meanwhile, my father considered the expense of a college education, which with so large a family he could not well afford, and the mean living many so educated afterwards obtained. He altered his intention, took me from the grammar school, and sent me to a school for writing and arithmetic kept by Mr. George Brownell, a famous teacher who used mild and encouraging methods under him. I soon acquired fair writing, but I made no progress in arithmetic. At 10 years old, I was taken home to assist my father in his business of tallow chandler and soap boiler. This was not the trade he had been bred to, but one he assumed in New England when he found his dyeing trade would not support the family. I cut wicks for the candles, filled the dipping frame and the molds for cast candles, attended the shop, and ran errands. I disliked the trade and had a strong inclination for the sea, but my father would not hear of it, living near the water. I was much in and about it, learned early to swim well, and to manage boats when in a boat or canoe with other boys. I was commonly allowed to govern, especially in any case of difficulty in other affairs. I was generally a leader among the boys and sometimes led them into scrapes. I will mention one instance, for it shows an early projecting public spirit. Though not then justly conducted, there was a salt marsh that bounded part of the mill pond, on the edge of which, at high water, we stood to fish for minnows. By much trampling, we had made it a mere quagmire. My proposal was to build a small wharf fit for us to stand upon, and I pointed out a large heap of stones intended for a new house near the marsh, which would very well suit our purpose in the evening, when the workmen were gone. I gathered my playfellows, and together we moved the stones like so many patient emmets, 2 or 3 to a stone. We brought them all away and built our little wharf by lantern. Light morning came, the stones were missed, and soon enough they were found in our childish harbor. We were discovered, complained of, and several of us were corrected by our fathers, mine teaching me that nothing is useful which is not honest. You may like to know something of his person and character, for he was a man of steady worth. He had an excellent constitution, of middle stature and well set, very strong, and quick of hand. He drew prettily, had some skill in music, and a clear, pleasing voice, so that in the calm of evening, when work was done, he would play psalm tunes on his violin and sing, and it was agreeable to hear. He had a mechanical turn, was handy with the tools of other trades, yet his great excellence lay in a sound understanding and solid judgment in prudential matters, in private life, and in the little public matters of town and church that were brought to his door, though his strait circumstances and numerous family kept him to his trade, leading people often visited to seek his counsel. He was asked to advise in affairs of the town and of his church, and private persons came as well when any difficulty arose, for he was often chosen as an arbitrator between contending parties. At his table he liked to have, as often as might be, some sensible friend or neighbor to converse with, and he took care to begin some useful topic that would improve the minds of his children. Thus he turned our thought toward what is good and prudent in the conduct of life, and little notice was taken of the victuals, whether well or ill dressed, or in or out of season, so that I grew indifferent to food and unobservant of it, scarce able after a few hours to tell what I had dined upon. This proved a convenience in traveling, for my companions were sometimes unhappy for want of a suitable gratification of their more delicate tastes. My mother, too, had an excellent constitution, and she nursed all her 10 children. I never knew either father or mother to have any sickness but that of which they died, he at 89 and she at 85, and they lie buried together at Boston some years after I placed a marble over their grave with words mindful of their long wedlock, their diligence without estate, the blessing that maintained a large family, and the encouragement to trust Providence, set there by their youngest son in filial regard. By my rambling digressions, I perceive I am grown old, for I used to write more methodically. Perhaps it is only negligence that steals upon us with time. To return, I continued employed in the business of my father for 2 years, until I was 12, when my brother John, bred to that business, had left, married, and set up for himself at Rhode Island. It seemed likely I should fill his place and become a tallow chandler, but my dislike continuing, my father feared I would break away and get to sea, as another son had done. To his great vexation, he therefore sometimes took me to walk with him and watch joiners, bricklayers, turners, and braziers at their work, to observe my inclination and to fix it on some trade on land. It has ever since pleased me to see good workmen handle their tools, and it has been useful too, for I learned to do small jobs in my house when no workmen could be had, and to contrive little machines for my experiments, while the intention of the experiment was still warm in my mind. At last he fixed upon the cutler's trade, and I was sent to be with my cousin Samuel, newly established in Boston. But the fee expected with me displeased my father, and I was taken home again from a child I was fond of reading. And all the little money that came into my hands was laid out in books. I was pleased with the Pilgrim's Progress, and gathered the works of John Bunyan in small volumes, which I afterwards sold to buy Robert Burton his historical collections, many little Chapman's books, and cheap. The small library of my father was chiefly polemic divinity, most of which I read, and have since regretted that at a time of such thirst for knowledge, more proper books had not fallen in my way. Since it was now resolved I should not be a clergyman, Plutarch's Lives was there, which I read abundantly and to great advantage, and I met with Defoe his essay on projects, and Dr. Mather his essays to do good, which gave me a turn of thinking that influenced the principal events of my life. This bookish inclination at length determined my father to make me a printer, though he had already one son of that profession in the year when my brother James returned from England with a press and letters to set up his business in Boston. I liked it much better than the trade of my father, though I still had a hankering for the sea to prevent the feared effect of that inclination. My father was impatient to have me bound to my brother. I stood out for a time, but at last was persuaded and signed to serve as an apprentice until 21, with journeyman wages allowed during the last year. In a little time, I made good progress and became a useful hand to my brother. I now had access to better books, and acquaintance with the apprentices of booksellers enabled me sometimes to borrow a small one, which I returned soon and clean. Often I sat up in my room reading most of the night, when the book was borrowed in the evening and to be returned early in the morning, lest it should be missed after some time. An ingenious tradesman, Mr. Matthew Adams, who had a pretty collection of books and frequented our printing house, invited me to his library and kindly lent me what I wished to read. I now took a fancy to poetry and made some little pieces. My brother, thinking it might turn to account, encouraged me and put me upon composing occasional ballads. One told of the lighthouse tragedy and the drowning of Captain Worthalake with his 2 daughters, and another was a sailor's song on the taking of Blackbeard, the pirate. They were poor stuff in the ballad style, yet the first sold wonderfully, the event being recent and much talked of, which flattered my vanity, but my father discouraged me, saying verse-makers were generally beggars, and so I escaped being a poet, most probably a bad one. Prose writing proved of great use to me, and I will tell how I gained what little ability I have. There was another bookish lad, John Collins by name, with whom I was intimately acquainted, and we sometimes disputed, very fond of argument and eager to confute one another. Such disputation soon grows a bad habit, souring conversation and breeding disgusts, and even enmities, where one may have need of friendship. And I had caught it by reading the disputations in the books of my father about religion. Persons of good sense, I have since observed, seldom fall into it, except certain lawyers and university men, and those bred at Edinburgh. Once a question arose between Collins and me about the propriety of educating the female sex and their abilities for study. He held it improper, and I took the contrary side. Perhaps somewhat for dispute's sake, he was more eloquent, had a ready plenty of words, and sometimes bore me down more by fluency than by strength of reason. As we parted without settling the point, and were not to meet again for some time, I set my arguments in writing and sent them. He answered, and I replied, until my father chanced to find the papers without entering the debate. He spoke to me of the manner of my writing, observing that though I had the advantage in correct spelling and pointing from the printing house, I fell short in elegance, in method, and in perspicuity. He convinced me by several instances, and I saw the justice of his remarks, and so I became more attentive to the manner of writing, and resolved to improve. About this time I met with an odd volume of The Spectator, the third, which I bought and read again and again, much delighted with it, wishing to imitate. I made short hints of the sentiments, laid them by a few days, and then without looking tried to complete the papers again. Afterward, comparing mine with the original, and discovering my faults, which I corrected with patience and quiet care, I found that I wanted a stock of words, and a readiness in recollecting and using them. I believed I would have gained this had I kept on making verses, for the constant need of words of like meaning but different length to fit the measure, or different sound for the rhyme, would have pressed me to search for variety, and fix that variety in my mind. So I took some of the tales and turned them into verse, and after a time, when I had well forgotten the prose, I turned them back again. I also sometimes jumbled my collections of hints into confusion, and after some weeks endeavored to reduce them into the best order before forming full sentences and completing the paper. This taught me method in arranging thoughts. By comparing my work afterwards with the original, I discovered faults and amended them, and sometimes fancied that in small particulars I had improved the method of the language. This encouraged me to think I might come in time to be a tolerable English writer, which I was extremely ambitious to become. My time for these exercises and for reading was at night after work, or before it began in the morning, or on Sundays. When I contrived to be in the printing house alone, I evaded as much as I could the common attendance on public worship which my father had exacted when I was under his care, and which I still thought a duty, though I could not, as it seemed to me, afford time to practice it. When about 16 years of age, I met with a book by Tryon, recommending a vegetable diet. I resolved to follow it. My brother, not yet married, boarded himself and his apprentices in another family, and my refusing to eat flesh brought inconveniences and frequent chiding for my singularity. I learned from Tryon the manner of preparing some dishes, such as boiling potatoes or rice and making hasty pudding, and then proposed to my brother that if he would give me each week half the money he paid for my board, I would board myself. He agreed at once, and I soon found I could save half what he gave me. This became an additional fund for buying books. I had another advantage too, for while my brother and the rest went from the printing house to their meals, I remained there alone. I dispatched my light repast, often no more than a biscuit, or a slice of bread, a handful of raisins, or a tart from the pastry cook, and a glass of water, and I had the rest of the time for study. I made greater progress from that clearness of head and quicker apprehension which often attend temperance in eating and drinking, being, on some occasion made ashamed of my ignorance in figures, which I had twice failed to learn at school. I took Cocker's Book of Arithmetic and went through the whole by myself with great ease. I also read the books on navigation by Sellers and Shermy, and became acquainted with the little geometry they contain. Though I never proceeded far in that science, about this time I read Locke on Human Understanding and the work called The Art of Thinking by the gentleman of Port Royal. While intent on improving my language, I met with an English grammar, I think it was Greenwood's, which ended with small sketches of the arts of rhetoric and logic, the latter finished with a specimen of a dispute in the Socratic method. And soon after I procured Xenophon, Memorable Things of Socrates, which contained many instances of the same method. I was charmed with it, adopted it, dropped abrupt contradiction and positive argument, and put on the humble inquirer and doubter from reading Shaftesbury and Collins. I had become a real doubter in many points of our religious doctrine. I found this method safest for myself, and very embarrassing to those against whom I used it. I took delight in it, practiced it continually, and grew skillful in drawing people, even of superior knowledge, into concessions whose consequences they did not foresee, entangling them in difficulties from which they could not easily escape, and so obtaining victories that neither myself nor my cause always deserved. I continued this method a few years, but gradually left it, keeping only the habit of expressing myself with modest diffidence when advancing anything disputable. I avoided words like certainly or undoubtedly. Rather, I would say, I conceive, or I apprehend it to be so, or it appears to me, or I should think it is so for such and such reasons, or I imagine it to be so, or it is so. If I am not mistaken, I believe this habit has been of great advantage to me when I have had occasion to press my opinions and persuade men into measures I promoted. The chief ends of conversation are to inform, or be informed, to please, or to persuade well-meaning sensible men, should not lessen their power of doing good by a positive and assuming manner, which often disgusts, creates opposition, and defeats the very purposes for which speech was given to us. If you would inform, a dogmatical manner may provoke contradiction and prevent candid attention if you wish information and improvement from the knowledge of others. Yet speak as fixed in your present opinions. Modest men who dislike disputation will likely leave you undisturbed in the possession of your error. In this way you can seldom hope to please your hearers or persuade those whose concurrence you desire. Pope spoke judiciously that men should be taught as if they were not being taught, and that unknown things should be proposed as things forgotten. And he further advised that one should speak, though sure, with seeming diffidence. He also noted that immodest words admit of no defense, for want of modesty is want of sense. I questioned whether want of sense, where a man is so unfortunate as to want it, might not be some apology for his want of modesty. It seemed to me the thought might stand more justly, as this immodest words admit only this defense, that the lack of modesty springs from a lack of sense. I submit this to better judgments, my brother, in the year 1920 or 21, began to print a newspaper called the New England Courant. It was the second that appeared in America, the Boston Newsletter having been the first. Some friends advised him not to undertake it, thinking one newspaper enough for America. He went on, however, after he composed the types and printed the sheets. I carried the papers through the streets to the customers. He had some ingenious friends who amused themselves by writing little pieces for the paper, which gained it credit and demand, hearing their conversations and the accounts of approbation their pieces received. I was excited to try my hand among them, being still a boy, and suspecting that my brother would object if he knew a paper was mine. I disguised my hand and slipped an anonymous piece under the printing house door at night. It was found in the morning, and shared with his writing friends. When they called in, as usual, they read and commented. In my hearing, I had the pleasure of finding that it met with their approval, and in their guesses at the author, no one named any but men of learning and ingenuity encouraged. I wrote several more pieces and conveyed them the same way, and they were equally approved. I kept my secret until my small fund of cents for such performances was well exhausted. And I discovered it, and my brother's acquaintance began to consider me more, which did not quite please my brother, who thought, not without reason, that it tended to make me too vain. This perhaps helped our differences, for though a brother, he considered himself my master and me his apprentice, and expected the same service as from another. I thought he demeaned me too much in some things, and from a brother I expected more indulgence. Our disputes were often brought before our father. I fancy I was either generally in the right or else a better pleader, for the judgment was usually in my favor, but my brother was passionate, and often beaten me, which I took extremely amiss, thinking my apprenticeship very tedious. I wished for some opportunity of shortening it. That opportunity came in an unexpected way. One piece in our newspaper, on a political point, gave offense to the assembly. My brother was taken up, censured, and imprisoned for a month, by warrant of the speaker. I suppose because he would not discover his author. I, too, was examined before the council, and though I did not give satisfaction, they only admonished and dismissed me, considering me perhaps as an apprentice bound to keep his master's secrets during my brother's confinement, which I resented despite our private differences. I managed the paper. I gave our rulers some rubs in it. My brother took this kindly, though others began to view me in an unfavorable light as a young genius with a turn for libel and satire. When my brother was discharged, the House issued a singular order that he should no longer print the paper called the New England Courant. His friends consulted in our printing house on what should be done. Some proposed changing the name of the paper, but he saw inconveniences in that at last it was concluded to print it for the future under the name of Benjamin Franklin. To avoid censure on him as still printing it by his apprentice, my old indenture was returned to me with a full discharge written on the back to be shown when needed, and I signed new indentures for the remainder of the term, to be kept private. A flimsy scheme indeed, yet it was executed at once, and the paper went on, under my name, for several months at length. A fresh difference arose between us, and I asserted my freedom, presuming he would not venture to produce the new indentures. It was not fair in me to take this advantage, and I count it one of the first errata of my life. But under the resentment stirred by the blows his passion often urged him to bestow upon me, the unfairness weighed little, though he was otherwise not an ill-natured man, and perhaps I was too saucy and provoking when he found I would leave him. He went round to every master in town, and prevented me from getting employment by speaking against me. I then thought of going to New York as the nearest place with a printer. I was inclined to leave Boston too, for I had made myself a little obnoxious to the governing party, and from the arbitrary proceedings of the Assembly in my brother's case, it seemed likely I might soon bring myself into scrapes if I stayed my indiscreet disputations about religion. Also made good people point at me with horror as an infidel or atheist. I resolved to go. But my father now sided with my brother, and I knew that if I attempted to depart openly, means would be used to stop me. My friend Collins undertook to manage a little for me. He agreed with the captain of a New York sloop for my passage, under the notion that I was a young acquaintance of his. I sold some of my books to raise a little money and found a private passage with a fair wind. In 3 days I was in New York, near 300 miles from home, a boy of but 17, with little money and no acquaintance. My inclinations for the sea were now worn out having a trade, and thinking myself a decent workman, I offered my service to old Mr. William Bradford, first printer, Pennsylvania, but then in New York. He had little to do and help enough already, yet he told me his son at Philadelphia had lately lost his principal hand, Aquila Rose, and might employ me. Philadelphia lay 100 miles farther, and I set out in a boat for Amboy, sending my chest and clothes round by sea crossing the bay. A sudden squall tore our rotten sails, kept us from the Kill, and drove us upon Long Island. On the way a drunken Dutch passenger fell overboard as he was sinking. I reached to his rough pay and drew him up, and we got him in again. His ducking sobered him, and he soon went to sleep after handing me a book to dry for him. It proved to be my old favorite, Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, in Dutch, finely printed with copper cuts, a dress better than I had seen it wear in English. I afterward found it translated into many tongues, and read perhaps more than any book. But the Bible honest, John was, so far as I then knew, the first to mix narration with dialogue, a method that engages the reader as if brought into the very company Defoe followed it in Crusoe and other pieces, and Richardson in Pamela. Such thoughts kept me company as we drew near the island, where a great surf on a stony beach forbade our landing. We dropped anchor and swung toward the shore. People came down and hallooed to us, and we did the same to them, but wind and surf were so loud that we could not make out a word. There were canoes on the beach, and we made signs for help, but either we were not understood or the attempt seemed impracticable to them, and at length they went away. Night coming on, we could only wait till the wind should abate. The boatmen and I crowded into the scuttle with the Dutchman, who was still wet, and the spray beating over the head of our boat leaked through upon us so that we were soon almost as wet as he. Thus we lay with little rest until the wind fell next day, and we made shift to reach Amboy before night. We had been 30 hours on the water, without victuals, and with no drink but a bottle of foul rum, and the salt we sailed on. In the evening, I grew feverish and went to bed. I had read somewhere that plentiful cold water was good for a fever. I followed the prescription, sweated freely in the night, and in the morning was eased crossing the ferry. I went on foot toward Burlington, 50 miles distant, where I was told I should find boats to carry me on to Philadelphia. It rained hard all day, and I was thoroughly soaked and tired by noon. I stopped at a poor inn and lay there all night, beginning now to wish I had never left home. I cut so miserable a figure that I was suspected of being a runaway servant. However, I proceeded next day and reached toward evening an inn kept by one Dr. Brown, within 8 or 10 miles of Burlington. He entered into talk while I took some refreshment, found I had read a little, and grew sociable, and our acquaintance continued as long as he lived. He had, I suppose, been an itinerant doctor, for there was scarce a town in England or a country in Europe of which he could not give a particular account. He had some letters and ingenuity, though much of an unbeliever, and later wickedly undertook to travesty the Bible in doggerel verse, as Cotton had done with Virgil. By this he set many facts in a ridiculous light, and might have hurt weak minds had it been published, but it never was at his house. I lay that night, and next morning reached Burlington. I had the mortification to find that the regular boats were gone a little before my coming, and none expected till Tuesday. And it was Saturday. I returned to an old woman in the town of whom I had bought gingerbread, and asked her advice. She invited me to lodge at her house till a passage should offer, and being weary from my foot traveling, I accepted, learning I was a printer. She would have had me stay and follow my business. Not knowing the stock needful to begin, she was very hospitable, gave me a dinner of ox cheek with great good will, and accepted only a pot of ale in return. I thought myself fixed till Tuesday, yet in the evening, walking by the river, I hailed a boat going toward Philadelphia with several people aboard, and they took me in. There was no wind, so we rowed all the way near midnight, not having yet seen the city. Some of the company were sure we had passed it, and would row no farther. The others knew not where we were. We turned toward the shore, got into a creek, and landed near an old fence with a few rails. We made a fire, for the October night was cold, and there we remained till daylight. At dawn, one of the company knew the place as Cooper's Creek, a little above Philadelphia. We soon saw the town and arrived at Market Street Wharf about 8 or 9 on the Sunday morning. I have been particular in this account that you may compare such unlikely beginnings with the figure I afterward made there. I was in my working dress, my best clothes being to come round by sea. I was dirty from the journey, my pockets stuffed with shirts and stockings, and I knew no soul nor where to look for lodging. I was fatigued with traveling and rowing and lack of rest, and I was very hungry. My whole stock of cash was a Dutch dollar, and about a shilling in copper. The copper I gave the people of the boat for my passage, who at first refused it because I had rowed, but I insisted. A man is sometimes more generous when he has but little than when he has plenty, perhaps through fear of being thought to have but little. Then I walked up the street, gazing about, till near the market house I met a boy with bread. I had made many a meal on bread, and asking where he got it, I went straight to the baker he named in 2nd Street. I asked for biscuit, meaning the sort we had in Boston, but such were not made in Philadelphia. Then I asked for a 3-penny loaf, and was told they had none, not knowing the names of the breads, or the difference in money, and the greater cheapness. I asked for 3 pennies worth of any sort. He gave me 3 great puffy rolls. I was surprised at the quantity, but took them, and having no room in my pockets, walked off with a roll under each arm, and eating the 3rd. Thus I went up Market Street as far as 4th, passing by the door of Mr. Red, the father of my future wife. She stood at the door and saw me, a most awkward and ridiculous figure, as indeed I was. Then I turned down Chestnut Street and part of Walnut Street, eating my roll all the way, and coming round again, found myself at Market Street Wharf near the boat. I went for a draught of the river water, and being filled with 1 roll, gave the other 2 to a woman and her child who had come down the river with us and were waiting to go farther. Thus refreshed, I walked again up the street, which by this time held many clean-dressed people who were all moving the same way. I joined them, and was led into the great meeting house of the Quakers near the market. I sat down among them, and after looking around a while and hearing nothing said, being very drowsy from labor and the want of rest, I fell fast asleep. I continued so till the meeting broke up, when one was kind enough to rouse me. This was therefore the first house in Philadelphia where I slept, walking down again toward the river and studying the faces of the people. I met a young Quaker whose countenance I liked, and asked where a stranger might get lodging. We were near the sign of the 3 Mariners. He said that house entertained strangers but was not reputable, and offered to show me a better. He brought me to the Crooked Billet in Water Street, where I got a dinner. While I ate, several sly questions were asked, for my youth and appearance made some suspect that I was a runaway. After dinner my sleepiness returned, and being shown to a bed, I lay down without undressing and slept till 6. Was called to supper, then went to bed again very early and slept soundly till morning. I made myself as tidy as I could and went to Andrew Bradford, the printer in the shop. I found the old man, his father, who, traveling on horseback, had reached Philadelphia before me. He introduced me to his son, who received me civilly and gave me a breakfast, but told me he did not at present want a hand. Being lately supplied with one, he added that another printer in town, one Keimer, had lately set up and might employ me, and that if not, I should be welcome to lodge at his house, and he would give me a little work now and then till fuller business should offer. The old gentleman offered to go with me to the new printer, and when we found him, he introduced me as a young man of the trade who might be useful. The printer asked a few questions, put a composing stick in my hand to see how I worked, and said he would soon employ me, though he had nothing ready that day, taking the old gentleman to be a townsman friendly to him. He talked freely of his plans and prospects. I stood by and heard how one was a crafty old sophister and the other a mere novice, and when I told the new printer who the old gentleman truly was, he was much surprised. His printing house held a shattered press and a worn font of English type. He was setting an elegy on Aquila Rose, an ingenious young man, much respected, clerk of the assembly, and a pretty poet. The printer, who made verses himself, composed directly in the types out of his head, so there was no manuscript copy, and he had only one pair of cases. I set his press in order as best I could, promised to return and print the elegy when ready, and went back to Bradford, who found me a small job and a lodging. A few days later, the new printer sent for me to print the elegy, and he had now another pair of cases and a pamphlet to reprint. I found both printers poorly qualified. Bradford had not been bred to the business and was very illiterate. The new man, though something of a scholar, was only a compositor who knew nothing of presswork, and had a good deal of the knave in his make-up. He had once been among the French prophets, and could act their enthusiastic agitations. He professed no particular religion, carrying a little of all on occasion, and was very ignorant of the world. He disliked my lodging with Bradford while I worked for him, yet his own house had no furniture, so he placed me with Mr. Reed, the owner, and with my chest and clothes now arrived, I made a more respectable appearance in the eyes of Miss Reed. I began to know some young people in the town who loved reading, and I passed my evenings pleasantly with them by industry and frugality. I gained a little money and lived agreeably, forgetting Boston as much as I could. I wished few there to know where I was, except my friend Collins, who kept my secret in time. An incident drew me back sooner than I had planned. My brother-in-law, Robert Holmes, master of a sloop that traded between Boston and Delaware, heard of me at Newcastle and wrote, urging me to return. He assured me of the goodwill of my friends, and that matters would be accommodated to my mind. I answered with thanks, and set forth my reasons for quitting Boston so plainly that he saw I was not so wrong as he had thought. While this passed, events were moving, of which I then knew nothing. Sir William Keith, governor of the province, was at Newcastle. Captain Holmes, in his company, when my letter arrived, spoke of me and showed it. The governor, surprised at my age, said that I seemed a promising young man who should be encouraged, and that the printers at Philadelphia were wretched. He believed I would succeed if I set up there, and he would procure me public business and lend me his interest soon after. As Keimer and I worked by the window, we saw the governor and another gentleman, later known to me as Colonel French, cross the street to our house. Finely dressed Keimer ran down at once, thinking they came to visit him. But the governor asked for me and came up with a politeness I was unused to. He made me many compliments, said he wished my acquaintance, and kindly blamed me for not making myself known sooner. He would have me to the tavern with Colonel French to taste some excellent Madeira, and I went, while Keimer stared like a poisoned pig over the wine he proposed, that I set up my own business and laid out the chances of success. He and Colonel French both assured me of their interest in obtaining the public printing of both governments. When I doubted whether my father would assist, Sir William said he would write a letter to him setting forth the advantages, and expected to prevail. Agreed that I would return to Boston in the first vessel with the governor's letter, keeping the plan secret while I continued my work, and now and then dined with him, which I thought a great honor, At the end of April 1724, a small vessel offered for Boston. I took leave of Keimer, as if only going to see my friends. The governor gave me a generous letter in my favor, strongly recommending the project that I set up at Philadelphia as the path to my fortune. We struck on a shoal in the bay and sprang a leak, and in a blustering sea we pumped almost continually. Yet at last came safe to Boston in about a fortnight. I had been absent 7 months, and my friends had heard nothing of me, for my brother Holmes had not returned and had not written. My sudden appearance surprised the family, and all were glad to see me and made me welcome, except my brother. I visited him at his printing house, better dressed than in his service, with a genteel suit, a watch, and near £5 in silver. He received me coldly, looked me over, and turned to his work. The journeyman asked where I had been, what the country was, and how I liked it. I praised it, and declared my intent to return. When one asked what money we used, I spread a handful of silver before them, a Roree show in Boston where paper passed for money. Then I let them see my watch, and while my brother sat sullen, I gave them a piece of 8 to drink and took my leave. This visit offended my brother greatly. When my mother later spoke of reconciliation and hoped we would live as brothers, he said I had insulted him before his people in a way he could not forgive. Though in truth he was mistaken, my father received the governor's letter with some surprise and said little until Captain Holmes returned. He then asked Holmes about Keith and added that it showed small discretion to set up a boy in business who wanted yet 3 years to be of age. Holmes spoke in favor of the plan, but my father held it improper and gave a flat denial. He wrote a civil letter to Sir William, thanking him for his kindness yet declining to assist me in setting up, since I was too young for so weighty a business and the preparation would be costly. My friend Collins, a clerk in the post office, was much pleased with my account of the new country and resolved to go there also. While I awaited my father's decision, he set out by land to Rhode Island, leaving his books, a fair collection of mathematics and natural philosophy, to follow with mine to New York, where he would wait. Though my father refused the proposition, he was pleased that I had gained a good character from a person of note, and that I had equipped myself so handsomely by my own industry. Seeing no hope of peace between my brother and me, he consented that I should return to Philadelphia. He advised me to behave respectfully, to seek the general esteem, and to avoid lampooning and libeling, to which he thought I leaned by steady industry and prudent parsimony. He said I might save enough by the time I was 21 to set up, and if I came near it he would help me with the rest. This was all I could obtain, with some small gifts as tokens of my parents' love, and I embarked again for New York with their approbation and blessing. The sloop put in at Newport in Rhode Island, where I visited my brother John. Long settled there, he received me very affectionately, for he always loved me. A friend of his named Vernon had about £35 due in Pennsylvania, and asked me to receive it and hold it until he sent directions, giving me an order that later caused me much uneasiness. At Newport we took in several passengers for New York. Among them were 2 young women who kept company together, and a grave, sensible, matron-like Quaker woman with her attendants. I had been ready to do the matron some small services, which gained me her goodwill. Seeing a growing familiarity between me and the 2 young women, which they encouraged, she took me aside and warned me gently that they were bad women and would draw me into danger, and she urged me to avoid them. At first I did not think so ill of them, but she told me what she had seen and heard, and I was convinced. I thanked her for the advice and promised to follow it. When we arrived at New York, the 2 women told me where they lived and invited me to visit, but I kept away. It was well that I did, for the next day the captain missed a silver spoon and other goods, searched their lodgings by warrant, found stolen items, and had the thieves punished. Though we had once scraped upon a sunken rock, this new escape seemed of greater moment to me in New York. I found my old friend Collins, arrived some time before we had grown up together, shared books, and spent many hours in study. He had a quick genius for mathematics, and in Boston had been sober, industrious, and well regarded during my absence. He had fallen into the habit of drinking brandy, and by his own account, and that of others, had been daily drunk since reaching New York. He had also gambled and lost his money, so I was forced to pay his lodging and his costs to and at Philadelphia, which pressed upon me hard. The governor of New York, Burnet, who was the son of Bishop Burnet, heard from the captain that one of his passengers had many books, and wished to see me. I visited him and would have taken Collins, but he was not sober. The governor treated me kindly and showed me his large library, and we spoke at length of books and authors to a poor youth. This notice from a second governor was very pleasing. We then set out toward Philadelphia. Along the way, I received the money from Vernon, without which we could scarcely have completed our journey. Collins wished for employment in a counting house, but whether by his breath or his behavior his drinking was discovered, and though he had recommendations, he found no success. He stayed where I lodged and boarded, still at my expense, knowing I held Vernon's money. He borrowed from me often, and always promised repayment when he should be in business. At length, he had taken so much that I was distressed. Fearing a demand from Vernon, his drinking continued, and we sometimes quarreled, for even a little intoxicated. He was very fractious once on the Delaware, in a boat with other young men. We took turns at the oars. Collins refused his turn and said he would be rowed home. Refused, soured by his conduct, and he swore he would make me row or throw me overboard. He came stepping along the thwarts and struck at me. I set my hand beneath him and rose, and he went head first into the river. I knew him to be a good swimmer, so I felt little concern. Before he could reach the boat, we pulled a few strokes to keep out of his grasp, and asked if he would row. Still sliding her away, he would not promise and grew vexed. But at last, seeing him tire, we lifted him in and brought him home, dripping wet in the evening. After that we exchanged few civil words. A West India captain, who sought a tutor for the sons of a gentleman in Barbados, met with him and agreed to carry him there. He left me, promising to remit the first money he should receive to discharge his debt, but I never heard of him again breaking into Vernon's. Money was one of the first great errors of my life. It showed that my father was not far wrong when he judged me too young to manage important business. Sir William, having read my father's letter, said my father was too prudent. He added that discretion does not always attend years, nor is youth always without it, since my father would not set me up. Sir William declared he asked for an inventory of the things needed from England, and said he would send for them, to be repaid when I was able. He resolved to have a good printer in the province, and felt sure I would succeed. He spoke so cordially that I did not doubt him. I kept this proposal secret in Philadelphia. Had it been known that I depended on the governor, some friend who knew him better might have warned me, for it was said he was liberal in promises he did not mean to keep. Yet he had offered these favors without any request from me, and I believed him one of the best men in the world. I presented an inventory for a small printing house, which came to about £100 sterling. He liked it, and asked whether my being in England to choose types and see to the quality might be an advantage. He added that I might form acquaintances and correspondence in bookselling and stationery. I agreed that this would be useful. Then he directed me to prepare to go on the annual ship named Annis, the only regular vessel then passing between London and Philadelphia. It would be some months before she sailed, so I continued working with Keimer. I fretted about the money Collins had taken, and daily feared a call from Vernon. which did not in fact come for several years during this time. I recalled my first voyage from Boston when we were becalmed off Block Island, and our people caught many cod. I was then abstaining from animal food, and considered that taking a fish was a kind of unprovoked murder, since it could never have done us any harm. Yet I had once been fond of fish, and when the cod came hot from the pan, it smelled admirably well. I balanced between principle and inclination until I remembered that smaller fish were taken from the stomachs of the larger. If they ate one another, I reasoned, we might as well eat them, so I dined on cod and continued thereafter to eat with other people, only now and then returning to a vegetable diet. So convenient it is to be a reasonable creature, for it enables one to find or invent a reason for whatever one wishes to do in Philadelphia. My footing with Keimer was familiar, and we agreed tolerably well, for he suspected nothing of my plan to set up for myself. He retained his old enthusiasms and loved argument. We had many disputations. I pressed him with the Socratic method and often led him, by questions far from the point, round to difficulties and contradictions at length. He grew cautious and would scarcely answer the most common question without first asking what I intended to infer. This gave him a high opinion of my skill in confuting. He even proposed that I should be his colleague in setting up a new sect, he to preach and I to confound opponents. When he explained his doctrines, I found several puzzles and wished to introduce some of my own. Keimer wore his beard at full length, believing the Mosaic law forbade marring the corners of the beard. He also kept the seventh day as Sabbath, and these 2 points were essential with him. I disliked both, yet agreed to admit them if he would adopt the doctrine of using no animal food. He doubted his constitution would bear it. I assured him it would, and that he would be the better for it. Was a great eater, and I expected some diversion in half-starving him. He consented to try, provided I kept him company. We held to it for 3 months. A woman in the neighborhood prepared our meals from a list of 40 dishes that contained neither fish nor flesh nor fowl, and the cost was low, no more than 18 pence sterling, each per week. I went on pleasantly, but poor Keimer suffered and longed for the flesh pots of Egypt. At last he ordered a roast pig. He invited me and 2 women friends to dine, but the dish came too soon to table, and he could not resist before we arrived. He had eaten it all. During this time I paid some court to Miss Reed, for whom I had great respect and affection, and I believe she felt the same as I was to take a long voyage, and we were both little above 18. Her mother judged it prudent to go no farther. Then a marriage would be more convenient on my return, if I should be set up in business as I expected. Perhaps she also thought my expectations not so well founded, as I imagined. My chief acquaintances at this time were Charles Osborne, Joseph Watson, and James Ralph, all lovers of reading. The 2 first were clerks to Charles Brockton, an eminent scrivener in the town, and Ralph was clerk to a merchant. Watson was pious and sensible, and of great integrity. The others were more lax in religious principles, particularly Ralph, who as well as Collins had been unsettled by me, and for which they both made me suffer. Osborne was candid and sincere, though too fond of criticizing in literary matters. Ralph was ingenious, genteel in his manners, and extremely eloquent. We admired poetry, and tried our hands at little pieces. Many pleasant Sunday walks we 4 took into the woods near the Schuylkill, where we read to each other and conferred on what we read. Ralph inclined to pursue poetry, thinking to become eminent and to make his fortune. Osborne dissuaded him and advised that he attend to his business, where diligence and punctuality might in time set him up. I approved the amusement of poetry as a means to improve language, but no farther. It was proposed that at our next meeting each should produce a piece in order to profit by mutual observations and corrections. To set invention aside, we agreed on a version of the 18th Psalm, which describes the descent of a deity As the time drew near, Ralph visited me and said his piece was ready. I had been busy and had done nothing. He showed me his, which I thought had great merit, and he urged me to present it as my own. He pretending to have had no time, we would then see how Osborne judged it. Since he was less jealous of me, we agreed, and I transcribed it in my own hand. We met, and Watson's performance was read. There were some beauties in it, but many defects. Osborne's piece was read, and it pleased us well. Ralph judged it fairly, noting a few faults, yet praising the brighter parts. I had nothing ready, and I held back, asking to be excused for want of time to correct. No excuse would serve, so I produced my own piece. At last it was read, and read again. Watson and Osborne yielded the contest and joined in their applause. Ralph alone pressed a few criticisms and proposed amendments, which I resisted. Still trusting my text, Osborne sided against Ralph and called him no better a critic than a poet, and so the matter ended. Though the talk between them grew warmer as they went home, soon their walk bore fruit. Osborne, freed from fear of flattering me, spoke still more strongly in favor of the work he believed to be mine, admiring its painting force and fire, and wondering that one so awkward in speech could write so well. When next we met, Ralph learned the trick we had played him, and Osborne was laughed at for his mistake. The whole affair set Ralph more firmly on becoming a poet. I did my best to dissuade him, yet he kept on with his verses until Pope cured him, and he afterward proved a fair writer of prose. I may not again mention the other two, so I add here that Watson, the best of our set, died in my arms a few years later and was much lamented. Osborne sailed to the West Indies, became an eminent lawyer, gathered money, and died young. He and I had once made a sober agreement that whichever of us died first would, if able, visit the other, and tell how things were found in that separate state. No such visit ever came. The governor, who liked my company, often had me at his house and spoke as if setting me up in business were a settled thing. I was to carry letters of recommendation to many of his friends, and a letter of credit to buy press, types, and paper. Time after time, I was told to call for these letters, yet each time a later day was named, so it went until the ship, whose sailing had also been postponed again and again, was at last on the point of departure. When I called to take leave and receive the letters, his secretary, Dr. Bard, said the governor was very busy in writing, but that he would be at Newcastle before the ship, and the letters would be delivered there. Ralph, though married and with one child, had resolved to go with me. It was thought he meant to form a trade connection and sell goods on commission. I afterward learned he was displeased with his wife's relations and planned to leave her in their care and never return. With farewells made and promises exchanged with Miss Reed, I left Philadelphia. The ship anchored at Newcastle, and there we found the governor once more. The secretary came with a civil message that the governor could not see me, being engaged in business of great importance, but that he wished me a good voyage and would send the letters on board. I returned puzzled, yet still not doubting. On that passage the great cabin had been taken by Mr. Andrew Hamilton, a noted Philadelphia lawyer, and his son James, with Mr. Denham, a Quaker merchant, and two gentlemen named Onion and Russell from an ironwork in Maryland. Ralph and I, unknown to any, took a berth in the steerage. Mr. Hamilton and his son soon returned to Philadelphia on urgent business, which left more room. When Colonel French came on board and showed me much respect, notice was taken of us, and we were invited into the cabin, where we moved with thanks and relief. Knowing Colonel French had brought the governor's dispatches, I asked the captain for those under my care. He said all were together in the mail bag, and I should have time enough before we landed to pick out mine. The company proved sociable, and Mr. Hamilton's stores, laid in plentifully, made our fare uncommon good. Mr. Denham formed a friendship for me that lasted through his life, a comfort on a voyage otherwise rough with much bad weather. As we entered the channel, the captain kept his promise and let me search the bag. I found no letters marked for me. I chose 6 or 7 by the handwriting that looked as if they might be intended. Among them, one to Basket, the King's printer, and another to a stationer. We reached London on the 24th of December, 1724. I called on the stationer first, delivering a letter said to be from Governor Keith. The stationer opened it, discovered it was from a man named Riddlesden, declared him a complete rascal, and refused to receive anything from him. So the letter was thrust back into my hand, and I was left to ponder my case. My friend Denham soon let me into the secret. There was little likelihood the governor had written any letters for me, and no one who knew him depended on him. The notion of a letter of credit from him was laughable, for he had no credit to give. We both knew that Riddlesden, an attorney, was a knave who had half ruined Miss Reed's father by getting him bound as surety. The letter hinted at a plot against Mr. Hamilton, thought to be coming over in our ship, and tied Keith to Riddlesden in that scheme. Denham, a friend of Hamilton, believed he must know of it. When Hamilton soon arrived in England, I brought him the letter. He thanked me warmly. The information proved important, and from then on he befriended me, which later helped me, much as for the governor. His trick was a poor thing to play upon a young and ignorant boy. He had a habit of seeking to please, and having little to give, he gave expectations, yet he was otherwise ingenious and sensible, a fair writer, and a good governor for the people, though not for his proprietors, whose instructions he sometimes slighted. Several of our best laws were planned by him and passed during his time. Ralph and I were inseparable and took lodgings together in Little Britain at 3 shillings and 6pence a week. The most we could afford. He found some relations, but they were poor and could not help him. He now told me he meant to remain in London and never return to Philadelphia. He had brought no money, and I had 15 pistols, so I lent to him from time to time while he sought business. He tried the playhouse first, thinking himself fit to act, but Wilkes advised him kindly to look elsewhere. He proposed to Roberts in Paternoster Row that he would write a weekly paper like The Spectator, which Roberts did not accept. He looked for work as a hackney writer, copying for stationers and lawyers near the Temple, and found no opening. I quickly got work at Palmer's, a noted printing house in Bartholomew Close, and stayed nearly a year. I was diligent, yet Ralph and I spent much of my earnings on plays and amusements. Soon consuming all my pistols, and rubbing on from hand to mouth, he seemed to forget his wife and child, and I by degrees forgot my engagements to Miss Reed. I wrote her only once to say I was not likely soon to return. I count that neglect among the great errata of my life, for our expenses kept me unable even to pay a passage home. At Palmer's I composed for the 2nd edition of William Wollaston's work, called Religion of Nature. Some of the reasoning did not satisfy me, so I wrote a small piece of metaphysics, titled A Dissertation on Liberty and Necessity, Pleasure and Pain, which I inscribed to Ralph and printed in a small number. Mr. Palmer thought me a young man of some ingenuity for it, though he reasoned earnestly with me against my principles, which he found abominable in truth. Printing that pamphlet was another erratum. While I lodged in Little Britain, I befriended Wilcox, a bookseller next door, with an immense store of second-hand books. There were no circulating libraries then, yet he allowed me on easy terms to take, read, and return what I wished. This was a great advantage, and I used it as much as I could. By chance my pamphlet reached Lyons, a surgeon who had written on the fallibility of human judgment, and so began an acquaintance. Lyons often called on me to talk of such matters. He carried me to the Horns, a pale alehouse on a lane in Cheapside, and introduced me to Dr. Mandeville, author of The Fable of the Bees, who led a lively club there. Lyons also brought me to Dr. Pemberton at Batson's Coffee House, who promised me a chance someday to see Sir Isaac Newton, which I greatly desired, though it never came to pass. I had brought a few curiosities from America, chief among them a purse woven of asbestos that can be purified by fire. Sir Hans Sloane heard of it, came to see me, invited me to his house in Bloomsbury Square, showed me his wonders, and persuaded me to part with my purse for a handsome price in our house. Lodged a young milliner, genteelly bred, sensible and lively, and pleasant in talk. Ralph read plays to her of an evening, and they grew intimate. She took new lodgings, and he followed. And they lived together for a time. He was still out of business, and her income, with her child, could not support them. He resolved to try for a country school, thinking himself well fitted, for he wrote an excellent hand and was skilled in arithmetic and accounts. Yet he thought the business beneath him, and confident of future fortune, when he would not wish it known that he had been so meanly employed, he changed his name and took mine. Soon I received a letter saying he was settled in a small village in Berkshire, teaching 10 or 12 boys to read and write for 6 a week, and recommending Mrs. T to my care. He wrote to me often, sending long specimens of an epic poem he was composing, and asking for remarks and corrections. I replied from time to time, though I tried to discourage his proceeding. About then, one of Young's satires had just been published, and it proved a wholesome check upon his poetic hopes. I copied and sent him a great part of it, setting in a strong light the folly of pursuing the muses with any hope of advancement by them all was in vain. Sheets of the poem continued to come by every post in the meantime. Mrs. T, having on his account lost her friends and business, was often in distress, and used to send for me and borrow what I could spare. I grew fond of her company, presuming upon my importance to her, and being then under no religious restraint. I attempted familiarities, which was another erratum, and she repulsed me with proper resentment, then acquainted him with my behavior. This made a breach between us, and when he returned again to London, he let me know he thought I had cancelled all the obligations he had been under to me, so I found I was never to expect his repaying me what I lent or advanced. This, however, was not of much consequence, for he was totally unable, and in the loss of his friendship I felt relieved of a burden. I now began to think of getting a little money beforehand, and expecting better work, I left Palmer's to work at Watts, near Lincoln's Inn Fields, a still greater printing house. I continued all the rest of my stay in London. At my first admission I took to working at press, imagining I felt a want of the bodily exercise I had been used to in America. Where press work is mixed with composing, I drank only water, while the other workmen, near 50 in number, were great guzzlers of beer. On occasion I carried up and down stairs a large form of types in each hand. When others carried but one in both hands, they wondered to see, from this and other instances, that the water American, as they called me, was stronger than themselves, who drank strong beer. We had an alehouse boy who attended always in the house to supply the workmen. My companion at the press drank every day a pint before breakfast, a pint at breakfast with his bread and cheese, a pint between breakfast and dinner, a pint at dinner, a pint in the afternoon about 6 o'clock, and another when he had done his day's work. I thought it a detestable custom, but he supposed it necessary to drink strong beer, that he might be strong to labor. I endeavored to show that the strength afforded by beer could only be in proportion to the grain or flour of the barley dissolved in the water of which it was made. There was more flour in a pennyworth of bread, and therefore, if he would eat that with a pint of water, it would give him more strength than a quart of beer he drank on, and had 4 or 5 shillings to pay out of his wages every Saturday night for that muddling liquor. an expense I was free from, and thus these poor souls kept themselves always under, while I held to my simple fare and steady habits. After some weeks, Mr. Watts desired to have me in the composing room, and I left the pressman a new bienvenue. A sum for drink of 5 shillings was demanded of me by the compositors. I thought it an imposition, as I had paid below. The master thought so too, and forbade my paying it. Stood out 2 or 3 weeks, and was accordingly considered as an excommunicate, and had many little pieces of private mischief done me, by mixing my sorts, transposing my pages, and breaking my matter. If I were ever so little out of the room, all was ascribed to the chapel ghost, which they said ever haunted those not regularly admitted, notwithstanding the master's protection. I found myself obliged to comply and pay the money, convinced of the folly of being on ill terms with those one is to live with continually. I was now on a fair footing with them, and soon acquired considerable influence. I proposed some reasonable alterations in their chapel laws, and carried them against all opposition from my example. Many left their muddling breakfast of beer and bread and cheese, finding they could be supplied from a neighboring house with a large porringer of hot water gruel, sprinkled with pepper, crumbed with bread, and a bit of butter for the price of a pint of beer. 3 halfpence. This was a more comfortable as well as cheaper breakfast, and kept their heads clearer. The shop grew quieter in the mornings, and the work more regular. Those who continued sodding with beer all day were often, by not paying, out of credit at the alehouse, and used to make interest with me to get beer. Their light, as they called me. Being still in good credit, I sometimes obliged them for the sake of peace, and took the occasion gently to reason with them on thrift and temperance. Little by little, some mended their ways, and our labor went forward with steadier hands, and in these small changes I found the comfort that comes of moderation, industry, and the goodwill of companions. And with these words from the past, we close tonight's reading. May they bring you peace and rest as you drift into sleep.